Okay, let's get started. So if you attended our first webinar in the series, you've already met me, but I'll reintroduce myself to you. My name's Anna Weitz. I'm an engineer with the Southeast Onsite Energy Technical Assistance Partnership team, and we're based out of the NC Clean Energy Technology Center at NC State University. So this is the second webinar in our series of deploying onsite energy. This one is called Policies, Programs, and Funding. So last session, we talked about onsite energy examples and its benefits. And today we will discuss the Southeast policy landscape for renewable energy and explain some of the incentives and funding opportunities available to pursue onsite energy. So before we begin, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items again. First, all of you are in listen-only mode, so you won't be able to see yourself on the screen, and you won't be able to come off mute. So please enter any of your questions into the Zoom Q&A feature that you'll see on the bottom ribbon. And we'll have time to answer your questions at the end of the presentation. And we are recording this webinar, and it will be uploaded to the NC Clean Energy Technology Center's YouTube account, which I will put in the chat right now. So hopefully you can see, oh, that's hosts and panelists, everybody. There we go. So you can see our our first webinar is already posted up there on our YouTube page. You can go and watch that if you missed it. Also, when you registered, you were given the option to sign up for continuing education credits. So if you did so, we will cross-reference your complete attendance today with your registration and then send you your certificate afterwards. If you signed up for that last time, I sent that out to you, I think yesterday, your certificate for the first one. And you'll be able to receive a certificate after each of the webinars if you attend fully. All right, these were all the housekeeping items, and I'll keep my eye on the Q&A session to see if you have any technical issues or things that can be fixed in the moment as we progress through our presentation. So moving on to our content, we have two speakers presenting today. Our first speaker will be Brian Lips, who is the Senior Policy Advisor on the Southeast Onsite Energy TAP. And Brian also oversees our center's work on the Desire website. And our second speaker will be Justin Lindeman, who is a policy analyst for the Southeast Onsite Energy TAP, and he's also a contributor for Desire and a policy analyst at the NC Clean Energy Technology Center. We will also hear at the beginning and ending of our presentation from Isaac Panzarella, who is the director of the Southeast Onsite Energy TAP. All right. So moving to our agenda, today we're first going to have an overview again of the onsite energy taps, then move to an overview of the Desire website. We're going to talk about significant policies in the Southeast region, then discuss programs and partnerships in the region, then talk about funding sources that can be utilized in this region, and we'll finish the presentation by talking about how the TAPs engage with stakeholders. At the very end, we'll have a Q&A to answer any of your questions, so you can put those questions not in the chat feature, but in the Q&A feature. So with that, I'll hand it over to Isaac to introduce the TAPs.
Thank you, Anna, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here. We hope that this is a start of a dialogue between us and yourselves. Just a little bit to start out, I want to talk about the on-site energy program at Department of Energy. Through the on-site energy program, DOE provides technical assistance, market analysis, and information on best practices that's useful for industrial facilities and other large energy users to increase the use of on-site clean energy technologies. Here you see a list of the technologies that the on-site energy program covers. And on the next slide, we'll get into the TAPs. There's 10 regional TAPs. We're the Southeast Regional TAP team. And as you can see, there's three main activities that we undertake. One is technical assistance to sites. Another is end user engagement throughout our region. and then finally stakeholder engagement. The material we're going to be talking about today is really going to be of interest to both end users and stakeholders. And stakeholders include to us utilities, state energy policymakers, utility regulators, and other organizations in the Southeast region. Here's a map showing the taps around the country and the contacts for the different regions. And then finally, we're not only fortunate to be working with DOE, but also on this project, but also having a really great team here in the Southeast, which includes Brian Lips and Justin Lindeman, as you'll see today. They're going to share a lot of great information on policies and programs. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Brian with that. Say, Brian, you're on mute, sir.
Of course. Thanks. So thanks, Isaac. The center here works on a variety of projects across multiple program areas. And Justin and myself are in the policy and markets program area. And in addition to the TAP, our most well-known project here is the Database of State Incentives for Renewables and Efficiency, or DESIRE for short. DESIRE is a free resource. It's been around since the late 90s and has always been a part of the Clean Tech Center here at NC State University. It's historically been funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, and anyone can access it to find all the policies and incentives in their specific area for renewable energy, energy efficiency, energy storage, electric vehicles, and electric vehicle charging equipment. You can see the URL on the screen here. Just be mindful that it's DSIRE USA, not DESIRE USA. I'm not sure if that's a real website, but I wouldn't want to check it out on my work computer. And a little bit about the content of Desire. It has detailed summaries of about 2,600 different policies and incentives. That includes every relevant policy and incentive implemented at the federal level, every policy and incentive provided by all 50 state governments, plus the territories, every financial incentive provided by all utilities with 30,000 or more customers, and all the policies and incentives provided by the top 50 cities and counties by population, in addition to examples of local policies and incentives that go above and beyond what others are doing or that are particularly innovative. You can see the various flavors of incentives we include here, including all manner of tax incentives, including tax credits, tax deductions, sales tax exemptions, and property tax exclusions and abatements. We also include loan programs, rebate programs, basically any incentive that helps end users adopt these technologies. The one caveat I'll draw here is that we don't include one-time grant opportunities in Desire. Those can be hard to track down and not really worth our effort to build a whole new entry for something that will be unavailable in a few months. And we also shy away from incentives that aren't specific to renewable energy or energy efficiency or electric vehicles. There may be other economic development incentives at the state or local level that are tied to job creation or investment in a facility, and renewables or efficiency improvements may be eligible for those programs. But if it's not specific to energy, we'll likely keep that out of the database. Otherwise, Desire's scope could become unsustainable, and the experience for the user could become more challenging than it already is with 2,600 different policies and incentives specifically for renewables and efficiency. And in Desire, we also draw a distinction between what we call incentives versus policies. Like I just said, incentives basically help fund a project, whereas policies underlie the electric utility industry and establish mandates through things like renewable portfolio standards, building energy codes, or energy standards for public buildings. Other policies in the database describe how a user can use the technology or interact with the grid, like net metering policies and interconnection standards. And now for further explanation, I'll take us on a quick tour of Desire. All right. Let's see. All right, so here is the homepage for Desire. From here, you see the map. You can click on your state if you like, or you can simply type in your zip code in this search box, which I will do here. And then this pulls up a filtered list of all the policies and incentives specific to that zip code. And you'll see mixed in here are federal programs, since I am eligible for those as well. From here, I could click this blue apply filter button if I want to narrow it down to a specific technology or a specific program type. Maybe I just want to find loan programs. I can do that. And then that filters the list further, so just these 6 loan programs. But let me remove that. And for any one of these, you can click in to see the full details. Always note at the top here is the date at which we most recently updated it. I just updated this one earlier this week. This is Duke Energy's non-residential energy efficiency rebate program. Here's the link to the program website if I want to look at more, if I want to look at the website specifically. Here are the eligible technologies. And then here's a quick overview of the incentive amounts by different types of equipment, followed by a quick summary of the program itself, and then contact information for more information about the program. So I encourage you all to explore Desire to find any relevant policies and incentives that could support a project that you're looking for. All right. So moving on, across the country, 28 states have an RPS policy. Let's see. Oh, wait. So, yeah, as we go through this, I just note that we'll be discussing a variety of different types of policies and incentives. And for each one of these, you can find full details in Desire. So again, I encourage you to explore Desire. With one of those policies being a renewable portfolio standard, or RPS for short. An RPS is a state level policy, typically adopted by a state legislature, and it requires electric utilities to have a certain percentage of their electricity come from renewables by a certain date. States first started adopting these types of policies in the late 90s. The first states that adopted them tended to do so while also deregulating their electricity markets. In the 80s and 90s, if you were around for them, you'll remember they were characterized by a push for deregulation. Telecom, airlines, policymakers started deregulating these industries and were liking what they were seeing. The electric utility industry was a bit trickier and was, and still is, of vital national importance. So states moved a little bit more slowly in deregulating the electric utility industry. Texas and the northeastern states and some of the Great Lakes states, they started deregulating, and most other states were looking into it. And then, of course, in the early 2000s, Enron started monkeying with California's partially deregulated market, which then caused massive spikes in cost, rolling blackouts, and widespread rage. After that, any state that was still considering deregulation kind of backed away. And so we are sort of frozen in time here, with the states that completed deregulation still being deregulated, and those that remained regulated still being regulated. But all that is to say that in the 90s, the solar, wind, and other renewables were still very much fledgling technologies, but with a lot of promise and a lot of interest from stakeholders and policymakers. So policymakers in these states that were starting to deregulate, they were concerned that if they simply let the invisible hand of the market decide everything, renewables might be permanently shut out of the market. So they developed this novel concept of a renewable portfolio standard, and they said that utilities can get their power from anywhere they want, but a portion of their electricity has to come from renewable energy. And these requirements were pretty small at first, but policymakers have been constantly ratcheting them up. So across the country today, 28 states, like I said, have an RPS policy. But this has not been a very popular mechanism in the Southeast, partly because our states are still traditionally regulated. So our utility commissions have other ways of ensuring our utilities have a diverse portfolio of resources. And you might also say that there are inherent political or philosophical reasons why Southern politicians don't always want to adopt RPS policies. But as it stands, North Carolina is the only southeastern state with an RPS policy. The territories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands also have their own RPS policies, and South Carolina has a voluntary goal, which stops short of being a mandatory requirement. Now, on its own, an RPS policy doesn't have much of an effect on end users. So what if Duke has to have 12.5% of its electricity come from renewables? That's their problem, right? Well, in order for Duke to meet that target, they may have to develop customer programs that encourage their customers to invest in renewable energy. And depending on how the policy is structured, there could also be a viable financial market for what we call renewable energy certificates, or RECs, which a utility then uses to demonstrate compliance with their RPS. So in states like Massachusetts, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Illinois, these states have historically had strong REC markets in which customer generators could earn, real money selling their RECs to the utility. Now, another policy evolution we've seen in recent years is with states developing clean energy standards. They're similar to a renewable portfolio standard, but they're generally open to any non-carbon emitting technology. You can read that as including nuclear. And many of these targets are similar to North Carolina's, which you see here, which requires Duke to be 100% carbon neutral by 2050. Now, these clean energy standards are all relatively new and don't have the same degree of regulation behind them, and their end dates are pretty far out there. So we'll see how this continues to evolve, but certainly something to watch. All right, another state level policy that affects the electric utility industry as a whole are energy efficiency resource standards. These policies are similar to RPS policies, but for energy efficiency. They typically require utilities to achieve some level of efficiency by a certain date. Also, like RPS policies, that can lead utilities to developing customer programs to meet that target. However, here in the Southeast, no state has a real energy efficiency resource standard. Florida has a non-binding voluntary goal, while North Carolina is highlighted here because utilities in our state can use energy efficiency to meet a portion of the RPS requirement. So efficiency is not mandatory in North Carolina, but it may be a preferable way for utilities to meet their RPS requirements if they're struggling to procure enough renewable energy. Now, getting more directly into policies that affect on-site generation, how does a utility customer utilize the power generated by their PV system or other generation asset while remaining a full customer of the utility? One option would be a buy-all, sell-all agreement with the utility, in which the customer continues to buy all their electricity from the utility while separately selling all the electricity their system produces. Of course, in that kind of arrangement, the utility would most likely pay the customer their avoided cost rate, which is the rate or what it costs the utility to produce electricity. And then the utility would then charge the customer their standard retail rate, which is significantly higher than the avoided cost rate. Now, for some scenarios that could pencil out for some customers, but in other situations, that kind of arrangement will never pencil out. It all depends on a variety of project-specific factors, which the TAPs can help walk you through. Another option in some areas is what's called net metering. In its simplest form, a customer's PV system or other generation asset would be connected to the grid with a bidirectional meter. When the system is producing electricity, that power can first be used on site and cut back on the amount of electricity the customer is pulling from the grid. And then if the system starts producing more electricity than the facility needs, that excess is fed back onto the grid, spinning the meter backwards in the process, at which point the customer is essentially being credited at the retail rate for their electricity. And then at the end of the month, the customer's bill will represent the difference between what the customer consumed and what they produced. In the event they're a net producer over the course of the month, that difference would appear as a credit on their next monthly bill. Now, that's a very simplified explanation of net metering. In practice, there are dozens of decision points a policymaker or utility could play with to make it either more favorable or less favorable to customer generators. But for our purposes, we consider a compensation policy to be true net metering if the netting occurs over the course of a whole month. Now, the state may treat that excess generation at the end of the month in different ways. Maybe it's simply rolled over to the next month as a kilowatt hour credit, or maybe it's credited to the next bill as a monetary value based on the avoided cost rate. Whatever happens to that net excess generation at the end of the month, we still consider that policy to be net metering, again, if the netting happens over the course of the entire month. But increasingly, we're seeing utilities shrinking that netting period. In some cases, the netting can happen instantaneously, where you consume whatever you're producing and cutting down on what you import from the grid. And in that respect, your generation is essentially worth the retail rate. But the moment you export to the grid, your meter registers that export, and you are credited at some different rate. Maybe the avoided cost rate, maybe some other rate, but not the retail rate. Again, if you want to know the specifics of any state's net metering rules, you can find that in Desire. Another thing I should point out here is that, for the most part, state regulatory commissions only have jurisdiction over the investor-owned utilities, like Duke Energy, Georgia Power, Southern Company, Florida Power and Light. For co-ops and munis, since their customers are either member owners, as is the case with co-ops, or voting citizens, as is the case in munis, they have ways to make their voices heard. And so those types of utilities are typically self-regulating and not bound by the policies adopted by the regulatory commissions. So when I say net metering is available in North Carolina, what I really mean is that the commission has adopted rules for Duke Energy. But if you're a customer of a co-op or muni, you'll have to check with that specific utility about what your options are as a customer generator. So talking about credit rates, this map shows the rate at which excess generation is credited in these states. In the Carolinas, Duke Energy requires customer generators to take service under a time of use tariff, where you pay different rates depending on the time of day and the time of year. When you're net metering with a time of use rate, that means your on-peak generation offsets your on-peak consumption, and your off-peak generation offsets your off-peak consumption. Florida has the most traditional net metering rules seen here, very similar to the simplified explanation that I provided, while the other states pay credit rates that are different than the retail rate. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Justin.
Yes, thank you, Brian, for the run through of the regional policy landscape. I'm going to close off our regional policy review by taking a look at some of the significant state policies and legislation that has been enacted and or approved over the last few years in the region, as well as a review of the region's disadvantaged communities before transitioning into examples of significant programs and funding opportunities in the region that you may be eligible to take advantage of. So as you'll notice, there aren't that many examples of noteworthy on-site related decarb policies in the Southeast besides North Carolina. But through the Center's Desire services, we do track any new and upcoming actions related to this topic. And we do have various policy programs, entries in Desire as well that you can look through. So perhaps we'll see more action in the future that will add to our Desire database. But in terms of noteworthy state policies, you might have seen some significant developments in Florida, for example, over the course of the last few months, as the state enacted legislation that bans the construction as well as the expansion of offshore wind facilities and certain coastal onshore wind facilities. As the impacts of this law will be examined over the course of the next few years, it is clear that this will impact utility resource planning and may even push utilities, especially investor-owned utilities, to divert even more attention and resources to other forms of clean energy, including solar, which perhaps may result in increased incentives and on-site opportunities due to the lack of offshore wind opportunities and a resource gap to fill. So I do want to note that according to reputable studies of the state's offshore wind potential and actual wind generation efficiency, the state doesn't have strong enough winds relative to, say, the northeastern states to justify a significant focus on offshore wind, and in certain cases, onshore wind. But this bill cuts off any offshore wind opportunities and certain coastal onshore wind opportunities from accumulating in the first place. So it'll be interesting to see how this all unfolds and how other clean energy resources will be impacted or whether there's an advantage for them in the next couple of years. As for Georgia, they also passed significant legislation instituting statewide solar decommissioning requirements, specifically for companies that lease property for solar farms, and it applies to any new or renewable solar power facility agreements that have been made since July of this year. The requirements include specific directives for what needs to be removed from a site, including the clearing and removal of any solar devices and equipment, personal property, any supporting infrastructure, transformers, substations, cables, any foundation, and various lines and access roads. So if extraction occurs, each cavity would also need to be filled with similar or predominant soil found on the property before construction started, in addition to reseeding pasture land and site restoration, among other things. And this new policy also requires financial assurance from such companies, which is statutorily defined as a surety or performance bond, in addition to a cost estimate that must be submitted once every 5 years. And the initial assurance must then be provided by the time of commercial operation, and it cannot include the salvage value of the facility. And furthermore, I'm sure some of you already know this, but North Carolina's HB 951 is another piece of significant state policy that has been enacted in the last several years. The bill requires the North Carolina Utilities Commission to take, quote unquote, all reasonable steps to achieve a 70% emission reduction based on 2005 levels by 2030 and then carbon neutrality by 2050, and requires the commission to develop a carbon plan to meet those goals every 2 years. It also directed the Department of Environmental Quality to develop a plan for solar decommissioning, which later led to the passage of solar decommissioning requirements by the General Assembly late last year. And going back to the directive regarding the carbon plan, the most recently submitted plan is expected to be approved by the end of this year and is expected to include a significant amount of gas units to combat the amount of demand coming from increased electricity and data center usage in the state. The 70% emission reduction by 2030 may also be somewhat delayed closer to the mid-2030s due to a provision in the bill that allows for the commission to delay the goals in the event that authorizes construction of a nuclear facility or some sort of wind facility, particularly offshore wind, that would require additional time to deal with any technical, legal, or logistical factors. The bill also authorizes the commission to direct Duke to procure additional renewables through the Competitive Procurement of Renewable Energy Program and authorizes the use of multi-year rate plans and performance-based regulation. Next slide, please. So it's also important to know for context the spread of disadvantaged communities in the region to understand these socioeconomic factors impacting it. You'll see here that according to the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool from the White House, which covers census tracts that meet certain criteria under various indicators such as income, unemployment, language isolation, education, including communities that have more than 10% of people older than the age of 24 that don't have a high school diploma and are impacted by various environmental burdens, such as proximity to waste facilities, Superfund sites, energy costs and energy burden, among other things. And you can see that the Southeast region is covered significantly by such communities, especially as you head deeper into the South. As for Puerto Rico, there is almost complete coverage of the island, and the US Virgin Islands, for example, does not appear to have almost any coverage. So if you use the link on the slide, you can explore the rest of the country. You will find that the Southeast as a region, and especially the South as a whole, has the largest coverage of disadvantaged communities in the nation. Next slide, please. So as for programs and incentives, the utility incentives in the region more so cover things like energy efficiency upgrades for a variety of non-residential customers, with some covering specifically solar. But most of the utility incentives do not cover on-site generation. To give a good example of what kinds of incentives may be applicable to on-site generation or industrial energy efficiency, you can also find these in Desire in case you want more detail. TVA recently, for example, reopened its Energy Right energy efficiency incentives for commercial and industrial customers, which includes custom incentives of up to 12 cents per year per kilowatt per hour, which covers HVAC upgrades and heat pumps. And the program has an incentive cap of 70% of material costs with a max of $3 million per organization per fiscal year. As for South Carolina Santee Cooper, they have a rooftop solar rebate that non-residential customers are eligible for, as long as the system does not exceed the lesser of 100 kilowatts or a customer's max annual peak demand. And the incentive for this program is about 95 cents per watt, capped at 6 kilowatts, which would be, if calculated, will be about $5,700. And lastly, Duke Energy has their Smart Saver rebate in North Carolina, which includes a per ton incentive for new high efficiency heat pump technology. And if you want to explore all the various non-residential utility incentives in the region, as we mentioned before, you can go to desireusa.org to find those. Again, these are just examples of incentives and is not exhaustive of what the region has to offer. Next slide, please. So there's also been some significant non-regulated utility partnerships in the Southeast, including one between the federal government's General Services Administration and Southern Company in Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. The GSA for short is an independent federal agency that helps manage and support the basic function of other federal agencies, including by managing federal property. And they signed an MOU late last year to purchase more clean electricity for their federal facilities in the region to eventually reach 100% clean electricity by 2030. And then secondly, the most recent MOU, or the most recent utility partnership, was Duke Energy in the Carolinas signing an MOU with Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Nucor to help develop new utility tariffs that would promote clean energy development in the region. The MOU includes tariffs that will be specifically designed to lower the cost of various emerging technologies like long duration storage and advanced nuclear, and to increase on-site generation and help package carbon-free energy at an individual level for commercial and industrial customers. Hence the companies like Amazon, Google, Nucor, and Microsoft that are involved in this MOU. And to provide a bit more detail, the tariffs will be referred to as the Accelerating Clean Energy, or ACE tariffs for short, which would enable larger customers to directly support the emerging technology investment through various financing structures and contributions that would then lower the overall cost risk of such emerging technologies. This is where the support for on-site generation at customer facilities comes into play. And part of the ACE proposal is the potential development of a Clean Transition Tariff, or a CTT, which would enable Duke to provide a customer-specific portfolio for new carbon-free energy, and it would match generation and commercial industrial load with an increased decarbonization of the grid in the region. And so the ACE tariffs would be voluntary, according to the MOU, and it would include protections for non-participating customers as well. Again, this is an MOU that was signed in May of this year, and the tariffs would need to move through the proper regulatory channels for approval, but it is still a significant development nonetheless. So considering we covered a number of utility incentives, there are also a number of federal incentives that you may take advantage of, with one of the most significant ones being the Federal Investment Tax Credit, or ITC, which ranges between a base credit of 6% or the full 30% tax credit, depending on whether you meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements laid out by the federal government. There are also a couple of bonus tax credits that you may use to potentially cover up to 70% of the project cost, including the domestic content bonus tax credit. And in order to receive this credit, facility and projects must use a required amount of domestically produced steel, iron, and other manufactured projects. So projects that begin construction before next year, for example, must use 40% domestically produced material, which will then increase to 55% for projects that are considering construction after the year 2026. And then there are different percentage requirements for offshore wind facilities that gives them some more time to meet these domestic requirements due to the somewhat nascent status of the industry in the United States. And so to receive the full 10% bonus credit for this domestic content requirement, projects must either be less than 1 megawatt or meet the IRA's labor requirements in order to meet and also in addition to that, meet the domestic material requirements to get the full 10%. The base credit for this is 2%, and it's given to those that just meet the content requirements, but don't meet the 1 megawatt threshold or the labor requirements. So again, much like the ITC, there is that multiplying factor that occurs if you meet certain labor requirements, and in this case, also a 1 megawatt threshold. There is also the Energy Community Bonus Tax Credit, which gives you another 10%. I will go over what that credit is in an upcoming slide. And the Low Income Community Bonus Tax Credit varies between 10 to 20%, depending on the location of the project, which I will also cover in an upcoming slide as well. And it's important to understand that the current ITC, which is strictly for certain renewable technologies like solar, wind, geothermal, among other technologies, will transition to a technology neutral tax credit in January of next year. It means that technologies like nuclear will be eligible for the ITC as well, in addition to solar, wind, geothermal, electricity, hydrogen, and thermal-based storage, among other technologies. And it's important to also note that there is a step-down period set for this tax credit that starts 2 years after what is known as the applicable year, which is the later of 2032 or the year that the country's power sector achieves a 75% reduction in emissions compared to 2022 levels. And this credit will step down in 2034 at the earliest, as the federal government hopes to achieve this goal in 2032. And so how that step down period occurs is that it will reduce from the 30% down to 22.5%, down to 15%, and then 0%. So it goes down 75%, then 50%, and then all the way down to 0 in a 3-year period. And so once that step down period starts, 2 years after that applicable year, which again, as I said, is 2032, or when those emissions goals are met, the 30% full rate will then start the 3-year step down period. So this, of course, will also happen for anyone receiving the 6% base rate, but I'm sure many of you are more so interested in reaching the full 30%. So if things go smoothly and the federal emissions goals are met, the federal ITC could reach 0% in value by 2036 at the very earliest. So it's best to pursue this tax credit early so that you don't miss out on the full 30%. And also, projects smaller than 5 megawatts can include interconnection costs as part of the ITC under this new technology neutral version. In addition to the ITC, there's also, as well as the bonus tax credits, you can also take advantage of a 5-year accelerated depreciation, which is available for renewable energy systems including solar, geothermal, biomass, wind, among others, in addition to CHP systems and fuel cells. And there is a 60% bonus depreciation offered this year, which is a step down from the previous 80% of last year. And you'll find more information on this depreciation in Desire. So now for those of you who are interested in receiving the full 10% energy community tax credit, the DOE has this wonderful and easy to use energy community mapping website that allows you to keep up with annual updates that are made to the list of eligible communities. This update usually takes place around May to June every year, having started initially last year. And in order to qualify for this credit, you have to meet certain project requirements, which include having a site on a brownfield site, or siting in an area that has or has had anytime up to 2009 specific fossil fuel related employment levels, or specific local tax revenue from fossil fuel production, or has had an unemployment rate that is equal to or greater than the national average for the previous year. Or if either of those two requirements are met, you can also have, or you also have to be in a census tract that has closed a coal mine after 1999, or retired a coal unit after 2009. So there are several ways to meet this 10% energy community tax credit. Also, you can see where there is the most coverage in this region, according to the DOE's map, is in Kentucky due to Appalachia, with some coverage in parts of Tennessee, North Carolina, and more in Alabama in the west half of the state. And as for Puerto Rico, there's also a small bit of coverage in the southeastern corner of the island, while the U.S. Virgin Islands do not have eligible locations under the community bonus tax credit, according to recent DOE updates. So if you build a project or system in these particular regions, you can access the full 10% tax credit on top of the ITC, or a base rate of 2% for this bonus tax credit if you fail to meet the labor requirements, which you can find those on the IRS website, or if you just search prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, there are plenty of resources that will summarize those for you. As for the low-income community bonus, solar and wind projects specifically with a capacity less than 5 megawatts are eligible to receive a 10 or 20% tax credit. The tax credit offered is via an annual program, which you have to apply for. Each year, the program offers up to 1.8 gigawatts of space, which initially started last year. And capacity in the program usually runs out pretty quickly during the initial 30-day application window, after which you can still apply. But applications will then be accepted after the 30 days on a rolling basis. And at that point, there will most likely be limited space, especially during the first few years of this very popular program. There are 4 categories of eligible locations, including a category for projects located in low-income communities, one for projects located on Indian land and tribal land, and individual categories for projects located in what is known as qualifying low-income residential building projects and qualified low-income economic benefits projects. And each of these categories has a specific capacity limit for applications. So if the solar or wind facility is located in a low-income community or on Indian or tribal land, you are eligible for 10%, while the other 2 categories you would receive 20% tax credit if you receive, if your application goes through. So according to the DOE's mapping tool, you can see there is plenty of coverage for eligible low-income area projects, especially along the eastern regions of several states in the region, while most of Kentucky, Georgia, and South Carolina is considered to be low income. As for the 2 U.S. territories, almost all of Puerto Rico is considered low income, and the eastern part of the U.S. Virgin Islands is also considered low income, meaning projects located in these spots are at least eligible for a 10% tax credit, keeping in mind that you are required to apply for this specific credit. For probably most of you who are viewing this webinar that are interested in this kind of low-income credit, you would most likely apply for a Category 1 credit, or one based off of low-income community locations, as shown in this specific mapping tool, which would give you that 10% credit if cited in those various green locations. I do want to note that if space isn't filled out in the previous year, and if it's not as popular for a given year, the leftover capacity for each category then rolls over into the next year. So besides the federal tax credits, there's also the Industrial Assessment Center Implementation Grants, or IAC for short, that were instituted by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. There's already been several rounds under this grant, with round 4 ending on July 1st of this year, and there are 2 additional rounds that have already been announced for applicants to keep track of. Round 5 ends on October 1st, 2024, so that's one to keep track of. And then the next round, that being round 6, ends on January 10th, 2025. So awards for each round are usually announced almost 3 months after the application due date for that round. And grant awards are up to $300,000 per round with a 50% cost share attached. And this is specifically for small and medium-sized manufacturing firms, as well as various water and wastewater treatment facilities. As for the eligibility requirements for this program, you have to be, as I mentioned previously, a small or medium-sized manufacturer or a water or wastewater treatment facility. But in order to be eligible as a small or medium-sized manufacturer, this means the following. First, you must have an annual gross sales amounting to fewer than $100 million, which is based on the manufacturing firm or entity. You must have fewer than 500 employees, and this number is based on the facility and or plant site. And you must have annual energy utility bills that total between $100,000 to $3.5 million. And this number is based on the manufacturing firm slash entity. And if the specific manufacturer or facility applying for the grant is an individual LLC that pays separate taxes from the overarching parent company, then the eligibility requirements for this grant are based off of that specific LLC. So if you're interested in applying, you can receive a free qualified energy assessment from an industrial assessment center, the on-site energy tab, or a third-party assessor of some kind. If you do go with a third party, it is not guaranteed that the assessment will be free. After that, you would then apply for grant funding to address the various recommendations given as part of this energy assessment. And then if selected, you will be in communication with the DOE to finalize your award. Overall, this process is done through EnergyWorks, and you can find more information on this grant program via the link provided. And again, the next round for this grant has an application due date of October 1st, 2024. Next slide, please. So in terms of state incentives, the region generally offers tax-related exemptions and the credits, as well as various grants and loans for renewable energy projects and energy efficiency. So to give you a glimpse into the kinds of incentives offered, we have provided a couple here. And there, of course, as we've always mentioned, more of which you can find on Desire. So firstly, Florida, for example, offers a solar and CHP systems as a sales tax exemption, including for solar systems and equipment that is used to produce, store, transport, compress, or even blend green hydrogen. Then for Kentucky, as an example, they give certain renewable facilities a 100% sales and use tax exemption, including for solar facilities that are at minimum 50 kilowatts, as well as other renewable energy facilities that have at least a megawatt capacity. And in order to qualify for this specific incentive, you would need to have a minimum $1 million in capital expenditures, and you are not allowed to recover more than 50% in capital investment when combining this credit with others that Kentucky may offer. In Alabama, depending on the locality, wind, biomass, geothermal, municipal solid waste, and green hydrogen projects, among others, are eligible for a property tax exemption, while in Puerto Rico, they offer a property tax exemption of their own for various clean and sustainable energy resources. And lastly, Tennessee offers a green energy production facility certificate, which are for facilities certified by the state's Department of Environment and Conservation. And they are those producing or storing clean electricity. And these certified facilities are given a tax incentive for purchase of equipment and machinery used to produce electricity from the specific system, which include on-site geothermal, clean hydrogen, solar, wind, as well as storage systems. So next, my colleague Brian will go through some additional financial opportunities that you may be able to take advantage of in the Southeast, as well as the two U.S. territories.
All right, thanks, Justin. Yeah, like you said, just a few more potential opportunities for funding projects. First, there's a business model that started in the solar industry, which is quite popular in the states where you can use it, and that's what we call a third-party power purchase agreement. This is an arrangement where a solar company or perhaps another generator approaches a utility customer and says they want to put solar or whatever generator on their facility. This third party will retain ownership of the system and perform any needed maintenance on it over the course of the agreement. And they may do this for no money down or perhaps a small fee, which is the main selling point for a customer, going solar without having to pay the hefty upfront cost. Now, since the solar company owns the system, they will claim the tax credits and whatever other incentives are out there, but you will use the system as if it's your own. You can use the power on site, participate in net metering with your utility or whatever DG compensation policy they have. And then separately, you'll pay the solar company for all the electricity that the system produces. So you'll see your regular utility bill decrease, but you will have a new bill that you have to pay from this company. But ideally, those two bills combined will be pretty close to what you're paying now, perhaps even a little bit less. But these agreements can be very long-term and establish what those exact rates will be that you will pay in the next 10, 15, or 20 years. Utilities can't make those kinds of guarantees over a long time frame. They typically set their rates for 2 to 5 years at a time and may even be able to make some adjustments based on fuel costs in those years in between. So these third-party PPAs can be seen as a potential hedge against the risk of rate increases in the future. Now, this financial arrangement isn't legal everywhere. Particularly in the regulated states, our investor-owned utilities have a guaranteed monopoly right to their service territories. And in most states, state law defines a public utility as one entity selling electricity to another entity, and then goes on to say that public utilities are subject to regulation by the state's regulatory commission. So if a solar company tried to offer such an arrangement here in North Carolina, they would fit within our statutory definition of a public utility and then be subjected to oversight by the NC Utilities Commission and immediately be found violating Duke Energy's service territory. Now, there is a workaround in these kinds of states if the legislature is interested, and that is what lawmakers in Georgia did. They simply amended the definition of a public utility to be one entity selling electricity to another entity, except for the case of a company selling electricity to a single customer from a generation device located on that customer's own premises. Another potential workaround is a solar lease, and these are more widely legal. To the customer, it feels very similar. You get to go solar without having to pay the upfront cost, but instead of paying for the electricity the system produces, you're simply paying a fixed monthly leasing fee. This should avoid the problem of being deemed a public utility. So you can see here, Florida, Mississippi, North Carolina, and South Carolina all allow solar leases. Another creative business model is energy performance contracting. This is commonly used by state and local governments to improve the efficiency of their facilities. These entities typically don't have big capital budgets to pay for newer, more energy efficient equipment. So instead, they could work with a performance contractor who will install the equipment with no money down, and the facility owner pays them back over time using the energy savings from the new equipment. So the net financial impact should be zero over the lifetime of the agreement. They pay nothing up front, they save on their bills, but then send those savings to the company that facilitated the savings. Now, like I said, this is most commonly used in the public sector, but could potentially be used in the private sector. And it's also generally used for efficiency improvements, but it's an open question in some areas if it could be used for on-site generation or if that would trigger the same concerns as third-party power purchase agreements. So something to look into, but also you want to look pretty thoroughly at. And then one last potential mechanism is what we call property assessed clean energy financing, or PACE financing for short. This is even more esoteric than the other options and relies on both state law and local implementation of that law. But it's a financing mechanism that allows property owners to finance energy improvements, possibly including on-site generation, depending on how the law is written. And those loans are paid back over time through a special assessment on their property taxes, or perhaps through a lien on the property. Some advantages here are that those assessments or liens generally stay with the land. So if you move, you stop paying you stop paying that lien, and the new landowner picks up where you left off. Now, like I said, the first step is for a state to enact legislation authorizing these types of arrangements. And I should note that North Carolina should be highlighted on this map now. We enacted legislation just a couple weeks ago to authorize PACE financing for commercial properties. And then the next step is for a local government or perhaps a state agency to implement the policy, again, depending on how the law is written. And there's no guarantee that there will be implementation of these PACE programs for consumers just because the state has authorized it. The implementation piece is the crucial part. Here in North Carolina, for example, our legislature first authorized PACE financing back in maybe 2012 or so, but no local government ever implemented it. And so the authorization expired before there were any real customer programs to participate in. So we'll see what happens with this new legislation. But in these highlighted states, they do have that enabling legislation to make these programs potentially available. And with that, I'll kick it back to Isaac to play us out.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Justin. You both, I feel like have only just scratched the surface, but have already shared an incredible amount of knowledge and insight with us on this webinar here. And for all of you out there, so how do you navigate, these policies, programs, and incentives? Because, there's 50 states and different utilities. It's a very complex question. And we here at the TAPS are available to help to do that, particularly for end users with sites. We can support you with economic and financial evaluation of your project, as well as looking at the different incentives that might apply, including the Federal Investment Tax Credit, USDA REAP grants, the IEC Implementation Grant, and others, and how those really play into the economics of your project. Another big area that I mentioned that we do before is stakeholder engagement with utilities and state policymakers. And on the next slide, you'll see a variety of engagements that we've done just over the past year. We strive to participate in engagements or to host engagements in all the states in the region that we serve. And these include tours of on-site energy facilities, conferences and workshops, as well as dialogue sessions. And one thing, across the region that we see is that people at all different levels in these states are interested in clean energy, particularly because of the benefits that it has for reducing costs at facilities, as well as reducing emissions, but also because of the jobs benefits from clean energy, not only from the jobs that clean energy deployment creates in terms of the workforce needed to implement these projects, but also another important aspect of jobs is manufacturing looking to relocate or build new facilities in our region. We see many companies looking to do that from across the globe. And one of the things that they are keenly interested in is how they can either implement on-site energy or procure renewable energy to support their corporate sustainability goals. So we look forward to seeing you all across the region in some way, shape, or form. Another thing I wanted to share with you is the DOE's on-site energy program website. The link is up there on the upper left. And at this website, you'll see a variety of resources, including on-site energy case studies which are descriptions of on-site energy projects where we want to share lessons learned and success stories of on-site energy. We have a series of technology fact sheets on CHP and other on-site energy technologies, a resilience planning guide, as well as database of CHP and microgrid installation databases. Facilities. These are all really useful tools for you and for stakeholders as you navigate how to implement and support on-site energy. One other key area of policy and program development that wasn't mentioned on the website here is state energy plans. And all these tools are useful to state energy policymakers as you develop your state energy plans. And we've actually contributed to a number of those over the years and are looking to do that in the future. In summary, I think you'll agree there's a lot of policies and programs out there that do have an impact and hopefully a positive impact on investment in on-site energy. And, the TAP team here, we're here as a resource to share information with you on existing policies and programs, especially those that apply to on-site energy projects, but also on best practice policies. And we're very fortunate to have Brian and Justin, two members of the Desire team, as part of the on-site energy TAP for the Southeast. We also are very interested to continue to partner with more and more stakeholders across the region. And as I shared with you, that there's this DOE website with a lot of resources on there. With that, we would like to open it up for questions from all of you.
Yes, thank you so much, Isaac. And thank you again, Brian and Justin, for, like Isaac said, providing a really comprehensive overview of the policies and programs and funding available for this region. So we have a little over 10 minutes left. So to open it up for questions, again, you all can type your questions in the Q&A portion. You'll be able to only see each other's questions once they've been asked and answered. So us as hosts will be able to see your questions, and once we answer it, we'll click answered, and then you can see the question. And while we wait for you guys to type some questions in there, I have a couple questions of my own that I'll ask first while we wait for your questions. The first one being, so Brian and Justin, what would you say to someone that's in a region where there are not a lot of regulatory opportunities in their state? Like, what would you recommend for them?
Well, when looking at the Southeast region, the fact that there aren't that many statewide standards and goals, whether it's energy efficiency standards, clean or renewable energy standards, among other regulations, it might seem a bit daunting for an entity that wants to build out on-site generation opportunities for itself or themselves based off of the perceived lack of support. However, with the help of Desire and, of course, other resources, you will find that there might be state utility incentives that you can utilize to advance your energy goals in absence of any sort of these holistic policies. And I will say that in the Southeast, you'll find that there aren't that many state and utility incentives compared to certain other regions in the country, though there are still some opportunities to take advantage of. And as we've explained today, whether that is utilizing a PACE program or a sales use tax incentive or whatever it might be, there's still something to benefit from. And where there isn't anything that you might consider advantageous, at the very least, there are federal opportunities like those we mentioned in this webinar, like the ITC, the bonus tax credits, the IAC grant, among other things that currently exist. So I personally would recommend using a Desire to scope out what opportunities exist in your area. And we at the Onsite TAP are also available to help figure out the market opportunities through policy research, among other things, in case you require more in-depth analysis beyond Desire and to perhaps look at the potential of stacking and combining incentives as well, because you can do that for certain federal incentives too.
Great, thanks, Justin. So our first question that came in was, does the Southeast TAP help any other type of stakeholder? Or sorry, help any type of stakeholder, for example, a consultant helping local governments with energy planning?
I can answer that question. So consultants of all types are important stakeholders to us. You know, it really takes a village where we're concerned to support on-site energy deployment. So we certainly do work with consultants that, including those that are working with local governments or those that might be working with manufacturing sites. The key important thing, though, is that, you know, we would need to be in contact, you know, so it's kind of like a three-way engagement between us and the consultant and the end user. And there's also one criteria that facilities that we look at in particular have to have at least a demand of 50 kilowatts or more. We don't really have the resources to look at a lot of smaller facilities, so we're looking at larger facilities with the technical assistance that we're providing.
Great, thank you, Isaac. And another question that I had was, you know, if people want to find out more about a particular utility incentive, where should they look first?
I would again urge everyone to go to Desire. We try to do a good job of summarizing these incentives in a way that my 81-year-old mother might be able to understand it. But then also we urge you to refer to the actual source materials as well. That would be the utility program website and application materials, or if it's a state tax incentive, definitely check out the statutes and tax forms and other official materials.
I want to add to what Brian's saying too. You know, we actually get quite a few inquiries from utilities that are looking to develop programs. And, you know, you as a end user, you know, certainly we encourage you to reach out to your utility. They sometimes might have custom programs or could design custom incentive for you, depending on the type of technology that you're looking at implementing.
Great, thanks, Isaac and Brian. If y'all have any other questions, feel free to go ahead and type them in. I had one of the questions that I prepared was, so can you provide some background on the PTC and how it interacts with the ITC?
So when it comes to the PTC, or the production tax credit, this is a per kilowatt hour tax credit for the electricity generated by a system, specifically for the first 10 years of operations. While the ITC, of course, for investment in actual, constructing the actual facility. So the full rate for a PTC that you can receive is about, I think it's 2.75 cents per kilowatt hour after you meet labor requirements, and the base rate is, of course, much lower, similar to the ITC. And the PTC, much like the ITC, also has that 3-year triggered step down period. So if you do want to utilize the PTC, it's important, much like the ITC, to get to it as soon as possible, because you don't want to get something lower than the full rate. As for how it interacts with the ITC, you can only choose to use either the ITC or the PTC for one facility, unless it's a co-located system. So if it's a solar plus storage system, you can use the ITC to lower the cost of constructing the solar part of the system, or no, the energy storage part of the system, and then use the PTs for the kilowatt power produced for the first 10 years of the actual solar part of the system's operations. But you can only choose one if it's, for example, just a solar facility or just a wind facility. And it will be best to determine the choice between the ITC and PTC based off of the capacity factor or the size of the project that you're intending on developing, because if it's a low capacity factor, it will be best to utilize the ITC rather than the PTC for a bigger return. But if you have an eligible energy generation technology and want to co-locate storage alongside it, as I mentioned, you can use the PTC for the generation side and the ITC for the storage side. Much like the ITC, the PTC will also switch to a technology neutral tax credit starting next year.
Great, thank you, Justin. We just had another question come in that says, for local government, what are the most common use cases that you help with, like water, wastewater, or vehicle fleets, etc.?
Let me look at that question there. So for local governments, the different types of cases we help with, we find that, energy intensive facilities like water and wastewater facilities definitely are, good candidates for on-site energy, particularly because they have space around them, but also because some of them wastewater plants, the larger ones, they can produce methane, which can be a good resource for on-site generation. When you take methane and put it into a combined heat and power system, that CHP system, along with solar and storage, can actually be configured into a microgrid that can be a resilient resource. Other places we're seeing on-site energy being applied is in bus depots, where, Montgomery County, Maryland, for example, is a very good example of a bus depot that has implemented on-site solar and storage because they realize that public transportation resilience is very important to their community, so that people that need that transportation can access it while there may be utility grid outages or challenges with other means of transportation. Other things that we're helping with include emergency operation centers, different critical infrastructure elements that might be out there in the community.
Great, thank you, Isaac. Let me answer that question.
One thing about, I wanted to point out, I'm hearing that the end of 2024 is important for where the tax credit, federal investment tax credit is concerned. And I've heard about this thing called Safe Harbor, where would one of you, either Brian or Justin, be able to explain a little bit about Safe Harbor, where it comes into qualifying for that tax credit by the end of this year?
I'm personally not familiar with that, but we can certainly look into it.
Yeah, and I'm not as well versed on that particular provision. But as I mentioned, even with the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements and other labor requirements, the IRS has a bunch of summaries of this that just kind of will tell you what in fact that is. So if you're interested, whoever asked that question, we could send you a link or something, but there's plenty of resources online to summarize those very nitty-gritty provisions.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Justin. You should refer to the guidance that the IRS has put out. And, there's a lot of good qualified tax or accounting specialists too that have become familiar with these regulations as they come out. I guess with that, Anna, we can wrap up the webinar here.
Yeah.
Again, I guess I'll thank everyone for attending here, for your interest and partnership here. We're in a time where, we have, I think, a very good combination of interest in clean energy from states and utilities, as well as a lot of great resources that have been put in place in terms of incentives, programs, grant funding from the federal government through the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. So we hope that, we will be able to follow up with you all, either as an end user or a stakeholder. And please feel free to reach out to us if you don't hear from us soon.
Yes, thank you. We have our next session on September 5th, so please come back and see us then. And if you haven't signed up, there's a QR code right there to sign up again for that last and final session for deployment best practices. But again, thank you all for coming today, and stay safe in the storm, and we appreciate it. We'll see you next month.